Hello and welcome to H619. And this is a clouded and rainy day. It's just a drizzle, but it's still raining. So I imagine we can look forward to some mushroom picking soon. Sounds marvelous. We start to mention Julian Barbour, the British physicist and mathematician. And when you read his book, The End of Time, you get a rather difficult read, I'd say. What he tries to explain in that book is very, very hard to grasp. And I'd say his new system that he developed together with an incredibly bright Italian mathematician, Bertotti, is just beyond belief. But it's a system where he shows that Newtonian mechanics can be done without the ideas of an absolute space, absolute time, and absolute scale. And everything can be done in this way constructed by Julian Barbour. What I didn't understand when I read the book, and that came to my understanding just recently, is that Julian Barbour takes it for granted, or it's something completely obvious to him, maybe even in an unconscious way, and that is that in this model there is no existence of objects. And I'd say the last lectures we had and also the discussions helped me to come to this understanding, and finally I grasped more or less what Julian Barbour tried to convey in his book. Because the other times I read it, I had at least 20 lectures about Julian Barbour, maybe even 30, and I read his book in 300 hours at least. But it was this understanding that there is no objects in Julian Barbour, and he doesn't explicitly mention that. But now when we started with talking with Bohr and Bohm, and I came to understand that objects, obviously, for obvious reasons in quantum physics, doesn't exist. Well, neither do them in Julian Barbour. So this further my understanding of Julian Barbour quite a deal. And this goes to show we will not only understand David Bohm and Niels Bohr and quantum physics, we will also come to understand a whole range of things, because the knowledge fields are not separated. And that's very interesting. Implicit and explicit exists. For instance, the terms of David Bohm in the world as a whole. It's not limited to only subserving physics or the microscopic. It's part of what makes up everything, the wholeness. And even if it's not clearly stated in the book, The End of Time, there is no such thing as an objective observance. And that goes to say now when I understood it, in hindsight, it's so easy to say what I understood and I can tell others, but until that point I could not explain it. I did not have the implicit knowledge of what the book meant. But after a while I got it, and then you can make it explicit. First as a thought form, you can so to speak ponder about it, you can think about it. Now, in the end you can also express it. Those are two different things. But it was vital for the implicit understanding to realize that objects do not exist in quantum mechanics and the problems that there is with objects. So this is an interesting note. And Julian Barber, that was quite a while ago. Julian Barber was almost 2 years ago. And it's of course very hard to say, if I had the knowledge of objects not existing 2 years ago, would that help me? I'm not sure I could have had that knowledge 2 years ago. Without this work we've done together, I would say that would be completely impossible. This does take a lot of work. None of these concepts are easily bought. They cannot be equalized easily with something that we all already use. They cannot be easily defined. So the point here is that opening up these thought patterns helps in so many different areas, all areas I would say in the end. This is really helpful because objects do have a limiting power of all things, and it leads to sort of, you could call it like subjective understanding of reality, but subjective in a diminishing way. It sort of cuts you out of knowledge in some way, and it makes your perceptions a bit skewed, not correct. And of course that has to do with the whole structure I mentioned earlier, that Richard E. Lind showed that we had a change from thinking with the body and going up into the head and starting having the head as an abstraction. And this abstraction owns or disowns the impressions, the perceptions coming from the body and from reality as well. And this creates a distance. And this distance is a bit like shutting out knowledge. And something that Ian McGilchrist, who's coming up soon here with a book, I remember it to be the 7th of November, could have been the 9th of November. We are highly anticipating this book, of course, but as Ian McGilchrist says, it's a literal shut out. It's the corpus callosum that shuts out things coming from the body, from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. It's being shut out literally. And maybe, in a way, for me personally, this realization that there are no objects in the life world of Julian Barber is even more sensational than there being no time. And you can look at these, you can use two different approaches, two perspectives. First thing being a question that arises in my head: why wasn't it mentioned in Julian Barber's book that there is no such thing as an independent observed reality, like what we usually call objective, in the universe that Julian Barber's, that you find in Julian Barber's book, in his theory? Why is that not mentioned? And allow me to explain that a bit further. In some ways, it's so obvious in an implicit way to Julian Barber himself that he never thought about objects existing. And that is interesting, because if you work with things mathematically and you work with them experimentally, you come to get a bodily understanding that objects are not of this world. Existence of objects is not of this world. And therefore you don't mention it. You don't mention what you know if that knowledge is implicit. And you can refer to Heidegger. It's not until something is uncovered it could be seen. So knowledge that you have in your hands, in your body, in your head also, when you're doing math, and the thinking space you use is not explicit. That's quite interesting. And this goes to show how the gap between science and the layman have become larger, because they know it, but maybe they're not aware in this regular sense. Of course they're aware of it to 100%, but that knowledge doesn't directly come to us as such. This is quite interesting. So my second perspective is these scientists who do things practically. They have loads more implicit knowledge than we have no idea of. And even talking to them won't guide you to that knowledge, because it's implicit in their system. They've been working with it for decades. Julian Barber, while I say 50 years now, is past his 80s, I think. So that leads me to the third point, that the distance never been wider apart between the scientists and what we ordinary people think. For us, still, all objects do exist. We talk about them, we try to use them as constructs, but they realize by working with them that it doesn't mean anything. For every time they do the mathematical calculations, they realize it even further. This is a little bit like a tool maker, or probably a maker of furniture. When he goes to the barn and selects wood for his furniture, he will select pine, he will select birch, but he will never ever select evergreen, for instance. And that's so obvious to him, so he won't mention it. And maybe he won't even think about it, but he will never choose it, because he knows it in his system. And then somebody can ask him, why don't you use evergreen? And he might do a gesture, and then he might ponder about it, and then you can have an explanation. say something to the effect it's too soft, it won't hold, it won't mold, you can't do anything with it. So you see here, implicit, explicit goes a long way also to explain why we have this problem. Isn't that amazing? I should mention that this is what Paul Feyerabend is talking about. He was working very, very close to practically working scientists. But it's hard to extract that thing from his books in a way, because he lacks the tools, because you need new tools, you need new words. Can't be done with the vocabulary we have presently. This also can be compared to the development of vowels in the written systems. You could say, this is quite a specific aspect, you could say that the vowels, when they developed some around 400 BC somewhere, they were something explicit of what was already implicit. Yeah, that's correct, you could say that. But it doesn't mean it's have to be that way. And that's where the problem starts somewhere. Because once it's being formed, slowly being formed, the vowels, then they are there. They are, you might say, objects. Yeah, you could call them objects. Why not? And in the end, these objects will sort of gather momentum and be as real as the consonants, the more important part. And now when I read a text in the year 2021, something to that, I won't be able to make a difference. But there is a difference. And that's why, for instance, we need etymology. We need to go back in history and see that those are actually more real, because it's only history that can tell us that. Nobody has this precise intuition. And I get tricked. I don't understand language because of this. If I equal vowels with consonants, I won't understand language. I don't get a whole perspective of the implicit language some way. Be harder for me to understand even. And it could affect my pronunciation. It's known fact that if you focus too much on vowels, you will have a problem with the flow in the words. Just thinking about that made me pronounce the word will. This is quite interesting. Once they're established, they get really firm and they start to causing problems. So even though the implicit doesn't have properties as we usually talk about them, like we can pinpoint clearly, there are actually properties in somehow in the implicit, and that's extraordinarily interesting. It's not everything, or not everything is a potentiality. You could actually go the wrong way in a bit. We did that with the vowels, they're completely unnecessary. Possibly the same thing could go for the existence of objects in a general perspective. But it's also, so to speak, them slowly being more and more established. And this was something that happened in Greek culture a bit earlier, maybe 200 years earlier, already in, say 600 BC, when our words for vision became look at something. And then we established both the looker, the subject, and the thing that was looked upon. Somewhere the distance starts. And that distance isn't healed or revealed until quantum physics. It will be easier if you go back to the implicit, because things are already decided in a way that makes knowledge hard to come by if we've been stuck too much on the explicit formulation. And that could be exemplified by going back. Yes, I know it's a bit tedious, but I'm going back to the different explicit aspects of something falling. And each one of those different explicit things, the 15th century, the 17th century, the 20th century, or a bit later you get quantum gravity. All those four are used into the 17th century understanding, the explicit there, that observation. You won't understand the other ones. You see, that those are incommensurable. And that stops understanding. You lock yourself into an alley, so to speak, a little bit. And this, of course, goes with all things. It's easy to see when it comes to gravity, because we had fairly recent development that gave us different explicit knowledges of things falling that are absolutely incommensurable. But in hindsight, as Steven Weinberg did, naughty boy, he thought that already the people before in the Newtonian classical physics did understand these things somehow. And he did the really bad mistake of seeing something ex posteriori and judging what happened before it was decided. Just the same thing as Einstein did with the superposition. Einstein was stuck. He needed to have the object somehow. He needed to have firm properties in what is actually proven to be undecided. And one third aspect could actually be the editors of the book, The End of Time. What would they have said if Julian Barber would have written in the book, like a chapter, there's no objective reality, another chapter, there are no objects like such. Then would they cut that out? That's too much for the reader. The book won't sell, Julian Barber. You need to cut that out. That could actually be a thing. I'm not sure about that last thing, but that could actually be a thing. And I can't even fathom what I would have thought if I read the book that way with those two extra chapters. Maybe it would have been too hard for me. And I should be thankful I wasn't presented with the whole truth directly, because my old system would have refused the knowledge. Because we do refuse. But we need to keep our integrity. Well, the system immediately keeps its integrity. And this goes to show also that this time it has taken, it was necessary. These steps cannot be made and should not be made hastily. Although, and this is my last point talking about this, although we can, in difference to Julian Barber, be able to explain this. This can be turned into explicit knowledge. And that comes actually easier by, because then you can put it into the format of classical physics and you can show the deviances. And even if it's not completely commensurable, that will help a lot. Because in pedagogy, in didactics, you're not looking for exactness. You never do that. Because the examples are always wrong. They have to be, because you need to talk to the knowledge the student, the learner has. It has to be put in the format of their thinking. And then it is not correct. They are not supposed to be correct from that perspective. They're supposed to help the person. And you can't explain something somebody cannot understand. That's a fact of life. And I'm beginning to realize that. So I think it was a good thing there being no objects were not mentioned in the book, The End of Time. And I haven't looked into his new book. I don't know if you know this, but Julian Barber quite recently came out with a new book. I think it's called The Janus Point. Maybe those things are indirectly mentioned in that book. I don't know. It would be very, very interesting to know that. I would actually love to read that book, come to think about it, now when it's been published. But these things are interesting. This is the didactical tools, the pedagogical tools, need to be something that the person understands. And therefore, it has to be on that person's explicit level. Explicit understanding. What's explicit in that person? Nothing else. Nothing else will work. Cannot work, shouldn't work. But that might be the problem in the controversy between these two doctor versus the scientist. It happened a while ago, and the scientist tried to show in a way that the doctor could not understand, and that would never work. And I think today we're coming to the conclusion who was wrong in this discussion, and his new knowledge with explicit and implicit rather points to the scientist in this case. He did the error. It could be as bad as me trying to explain something in English to a person who doesn't speak the language of English. I would be deemed the culprit, the person being in error, not the other person, the Chinese. Nobody would say to him, he didn't understand, he was wrong, because we all know what Hans said was right. No, nobody would say that. But that maybe it's an extreme comparison. To drink some coffee here, sorry, it's a bit chilly here today actually. Maybe that's a good example of implicit and explicit. I can say it's chilly and I can bring out a thermometer and it wouldn't make any sense the thermometer would show like 17 degrees, and what is he talking about? How can it be chilly? Well, the thermometer doesn't show the bodily experience. And this example, the difference is, which the thermometer doesn't show, is humidity. The humidity is beyond belief. I can actually feel the parts that haven't been touched by the drizzle, it was like just light rain, to be almost moist. And that, of course, the moistness transfer the chilling effect much more rapid. It's a big difference. This difference is analog to being in cold weather, where the air is dry, or being immersed in the same temperature, but it's water. Coldness is transferred to the body much quicker. And then a besserwisser would say, that's a Swedish expression, I don't know if that exists in English, but a besserwisser would say, oh no! It's not coldness being transferred to the body, it's the warmth of the body being transferred to the environment. And that's also a good example of implicit-explicit. And I do say, at some level, you will be perfectly able to say that the coldness enters your body. And being stuck on the explicit level, as some people would say, more knowledgeable level, more educated level, or scientific, maybe that. No, those people. That would actually be, I would say, in some part wrong. Because you need to speak on a level of the person, and also on a level which is in the ordinary language, and that's where we say that, traditionally we say that. It doesn't make it wrong. It's two different explicit ways of showing something, and we should choose the one that makes the easiest sense. Well, we do choose that anyway. That's what we do. I think Wittgenstein would say the besserwisser doesn't understand the world. I think he would be that harsh, because he was that harsh to himself. He doesn't speak the language, because the preciser thing is actually the fuzzier thing. You don't gain anything by the precision saying. It's the warmth of your body that is coming out into the environment. It doesn't add anything. And I think in this example it's so easy to see. So we can learn a great deal of perspectives with this implicit-explicit, which cannot be done without those terms. And those terms can be refined, or we can get more used of using them. And they reflect or are the same as the mathematical understanding you do by hand, you do by head, you do by calculation of quantum physics. So this can lead you in the same direction. You can understand the zest of quantum physics with these terms. I'd say that. And you can do that almost in ordinary language. Those two terms are vital to that. And I do believe those words can be inferred. Look at the recent past. We had so many new expressions and things we didn't have before the event of the computer revolution and the internet revolution. And and those terms are used in a specific way. For instance, interface, it doesn't really have a clear equivalence in, let's see, pre-70, something like that. It's a completely new expression, a new explicit form of something that was implicit in the computer scientists, the programmers before, at some level, and then became something explicit. And you can say that interface transfers something that is implicit for the user, not for the programmer. But for the user, it's implicit. He doesn't understand programming. It could be said for him to be undecided. But what he sees on the screen is the explicit. What do you see on the screen? Well, you see a waste bin, and you drag things to that, and you can throw them away, and get rid of them. And that's an explicit format of something that implicitly is quite different from the ordinary act of throwing something in a garbage bin. It's not done the same way. So this is yet another example of where to show this incredibly explanatory force in implicit explicit. And we have mentioned earlier in the discussion we have another channel I had to explain for people listening, and I would introduce that one in the next episode, I think, and provide a link to it. But we discussed this. It was called a movement, and as we become clearer and clearer with implicit and explicit, because that's where we start with also the books of David Bohm starts. Once that becomes clearer, we can also get a perception of whole movement, because that won't be understandable until the terms implicit, explicit are firmly established, so to speak. That will help. They will be part of the ladder to take you to the whole movement, to understand what is the nature in quantum physics, what is really there. And of course there are other examples. Implicit, explicit can go to help what Graham Priest, the famous logician who constructed para-consistent logic, how that works. Because it can be very, very tough just to understand it as it is directly, explicitly presented. And although taking in implicit, explicit could look in the beginning as making the whole stuff complicated, and at a level, yes, I agree. But in the long run, it will make things much, much easier. I can already perceive that. And this will actually embody knowledge. It's great tools. Really, really grateful to David Bohm for coming up with this stuff, coming up with it. I don't know, you could reflect about it. I shouldn't be too talky here, but this is very interesting, and I tried to, I think he was just in the border in between Einstein and Bohr. Maybe that helped, and he was a perceptive person. he had a lot of bodily knowledge, and he managed to stay on both lines at the same time. That's my own reflection. It has to stand for me. It's just something I pondered about. So don't take that too hard. And I was also mentioning time, space, and knowledge, or Tartan-Tulku. And when he talks about space and that we should soften up the objects that are too firmly established, it's the too firmly established explicitness of the objects will stop the hollow movement, so to speak. You get stuck somehow in an attitude. That could also be a bodily attitude. It is a bodily attitude. And you can also compare that with a poker game, where if you have too much explicit knowledge, so to speak, that will hinder the hollow movement. You need to be a good poker player. And that will also serve as an example for what an object could be. An object could be that firmly held belief in your head what the other person has, his hand, his poker hand. And in the end, you'll be stuck with only negating the poker hand. So, for instance, if I'm playing with another player, call him Jonas, I have first the idea he's having a flush. And then I got some indications, some ideas, some perceptions. He doesn't have it. And the only thing I can do is negate that and say he doesn't have it. And goes to show that it makes it difficult to play poker. You need to come closer to the implicit level. And you can still have knowledge there. And this is obvious with Julian Barber. He had the knowledge of the object. It was implicit. That's all he needed. It was even better for him than having the sheer explicit knowledge. So implicit is a well of knowledge, getting further to that and not be too stuck. And I would say that today we are too stuck in the explicit, specific pronunciation of reality. And we get stuck in that, and we try to use that instead of the more encompassing and more fluent implicit world. We get tricked by that. And this is formulated like this in the book of Tartan-Tulku. And this is talking about objects, the solid object. So by attending only to the apparently solid things and the contrasting space would result that is caused or result from a particular setting. You're zooming in, this is this focal setting. Then we cannot discover the actual nature of either existence nor appearance. There's a problem there. You need to grasp the hollow movement. You get stuck in one explicit, you can't see the shifting between implicit and explicit. And you will lose both existence and appearance. Isn't that quite interesting? You lose both. And that reminds me, actually, I mentioned Graham Priest before, and if you get too stuck on the law and exclude the middle, you will lose the effect to some degree of having contradictions. Contradictions are a necessary tool in some ways, in some circumstances, and you will lose that a little bit if you get stuck in the explicitness of excluded middle. This is what happened in mathematics. And this is one of the reasons Bishop really wanted to turn over to constructive mathematics. Although that meant a lot more work and discarding almost a century-old intuition about mathematics. Because that will, if you don't do that, you will severely limit further explorations in mathematics, further developments, because that would be a barrier, stopping thing. And we think in the beginning, just the sheer idea of finding more space, new spaces, is something completely abstract. And that's also an initial feeling. It feels like a word game, as a play of words. How can I find new spaces? Every time you try to find new spaces or find them, you will be more and more certain that there are actually more space around you, in you, within the thinking. And it's something you can see here. I'm in a room now. This is an enclosure. And I think most people today, when they are in a room, they feel more enclosed. It feels more narrow. It doesn't have the same expanse, and we are actually more tensed here. But you can open up. Even in a narrow space, you can find space where you explicitly didn't usually perceive there to be more space. And once you open up, your body will accept the new room and expand, and you'll be wider and you will be longer too. And I think this is an excellent position to show, like pedagogical helping tool. Look here, it is still open. So here you can see directly the openness. And in fact, even the solid walls are more empty space than they are solid space. Look. And somehow just perceiving this, thinking about this, will ease up and let more space come in. Space that's always present. And then you will, even in a crowded city landscape, find more space, find more breathing time. And you don't have to get like limited to the idea that most people have, at least in Sweden. I go to the countryside to find space, to be myself. And I think they mean that both on a bodily level, but also in a mental level. And fair enough, but you don't have to limit yourself to that. You can find a space already working in the city, in the town, in your apartment. And once you get to the countryside when the weekend comes, you're already a bit more relaxed, you're not as unbalanced. And you can enjoy the countryside much more. So there is space all around us, and of course the explicitness of there being barriers, you can still have that. It's a little bit, you can have the cookie and eat it. This is seemingly impossible in the older logic, but think about Newtonian physics. That limits a whole great lot what time can be, what room can be, and you have a much wider perception of space and time in quantum physics. You can see the difference there, coming from physics. So of course there are those differences. You can open up more, take in space. But pedagogical tools are important. This perception of the whole room being open helps me now, but also looking through the field, and what I recommend is using the sky, because the sky is always present in some way. Even though if you don't see it right above you, you can reach your head out of the window or something similar, and you get more space. I would say that death chamber room number 9, well, I should explain to the listeners. University of Gothenburg, they have rooms they have the audacity to call study rooms. They don't have windows. How they thought that out, I do not know. They hardly have air. And what happens in those rooms? You lose space. You need tools. You need to have open space around you in the beginning. But you will get more and more better at finding space. It's an improvement, something you actually train. And it's a new training, you never trained that before. We always as people have always giving into what is apparent, what it seemed to be. And what we do by thinking is question that. And that questioning is part and parcel of the process of developing and getting more spaces, getting more balanced. It's a very, very important part. It's, of course, to be complemented by doing things with the body, doing things that helps you to get more balanced. Those things in tandem will make an excellent development route. Well, I say thank you. I'm way too cold here. I need to move a little bit to help my bodily heat come back. It's dissipating, and I'm quite chilly now. You can hear it on my voice as well. Also a little sign of you don't actually have to see coldness. You can infer it from explicit traits and implicit traits. Well, I thank you very much.